Hey everybody, this is Brian, the overworked IT guy, W2BJM, coming to you today with my final review of my TYT MD-UV380 handheld DMR radio. I'm going to show you through the features, basically the vendor's website. The cat's going to give her input, and I'll give you my opinion on the radio. So let's kick this off. Here we go. So let's start with where I got it from and some important tidbits here. So the TYT radio manufacturer, you really want to buy that from a reputable dealer that doesn't import gray markets, put their firmware on it, lock the radio in any way. You want it as close to direct from manufacturer as possible. That's why I buy them for Radioddity. Radioddity does that. They sell it directly as if they get it from TYT, no hacks, no nothing. This is the radio direct from the vendor. So with that point, this is the Radioddity homepage you can see here, loaded up with that product. 1,000 channels built in, very handy. The manual actually says 3,000 channels, so they've probably added an upgrade for that as time has gone on. Scrolling down here, the very nice features. This does have the GPS enabled. Don't know how to use it yet, don't know what benefits there are to it yet, still sort of messing around with that. So far I haven't found a use for it in the amateur space, but you know, as technology advances, amateur radio will start to use it. It is a 2-time slot compatible DMR radio. That means tier 1, tier 2, full tier 1, tier 2 support. It's not going to take up both time slots when you need to consume one. Fully compatible with that. The killer feature with this radio, as opposed to the other cheaper radios, is this is a dual band, 2 meter, 70 centimeter DMR radio. So that means not only can you use those rare DMR VHF repeaters, but you can also use this as a great analog radio on the 2 meter band. So when you're out away from DMR repeaters, or any repeaters for that matter, you can use basic FM simplex communications. But also this does support talk around, so you can do DMR with your buddies at whatever fairgrounds away from whatever repeater, just on local simplex with DMR too. Very handy. Otherwise, most features on this are pretty standard. It supports a bunch of features that amateur radio cannot use. For example, the encryption function. Amateur radio doesn't allow for encryption, so we just won't talk about that. We won't use it. The rest of the details on here, I encourage you to check out. It's mostly around the features of the radio, some of the includes, which I showed in my unboxing. It is, for all intents and purposes, just what you'd expect out of a radio at this price point. CT, CSS encoding, emergency alarm, which we don't use, Vox built into the radio, which can be useful, may not be, depending on what you're doing. Firmware upgradable, of course, as most software-defined radios are, and don't kid yourself, whoever says these are not software-defined radios, they are. Most radios are software-defined radios these days. So, 3,000 channels, 10,000 contacts, 100,000 contact data, which is very nice. I have not done it yet, but there are features in this radio where you can upload the entire DMR radio ID database to it, so the radio itself shows you who's calling on the radio. So you do not need to do something like the MD-380 tools hack to run the alternate firmware to show you the call sign of the person on the other end of the radio. So that's the shopping page. Let's flip back and I'll give you a tour of the radio. So the physical device, what everybody wants to see. This is the radio. As you can see by the lovely glare the camera's picking up, that is not the backlight, or that is not the reflection off my monitor. That is the actual backlight. It's kind of hard to see because it is bright. I have not found a way to dim this backlight yet, which is one of my somewhat complaints about it, if you want to call it that. But it is very, very easy to see as a result of that. It does have its auto timer timeout, which I have set at a pretty high number, just for messing with it, testing battery life and whatnot. But the display is very crisp, is very clear. It's just very bright as well. So that's the display. The rest of the basics of the outside of the radio, we've got our belt clip on the back. I am genuinely not a fan of the way they did the belt clip design. The belt clip for these, the belt clip goes on the battery, which means every time you want to buy a new battery to have a backup or a third, you need to buy a new belt clip. Not a big fan of that. I really don't like companies that do that, but for me it's just the way they want to try to make more money, but so be it. Battery removal is very straightforward. Let's turn the radio off here for a second. Push this little lever in here. Battery slides out. just sort of pivots out. And you can see on the back here is the traditional stickers as you would expect on the back of a radio. Sling that back in. The battery, by the way, for those who are curious, 7.4 volt, 2000 milliamp, and kind of hard to get that on this camera. So, on the top, we have our volume knob and a somewhat misleading channel knob. So I was expecting on the channel selector knob, especially since it has numbers 1 through 16 carved into the hard plastic here, that this would be a rapid dial to 16 channels. However, you'll notice that this thing just keeps going round and round and round and round as you turn it. There's no stop on it. What it's really doing, and again, you can't unfortunately see it because of the glare here. Let's try this, but as I turn it, it just continues to change the channel in that direction, either up or down. That's it. It doesn't have 16 fixed channels it sets to. I think they just put that ring on there for vanity purposes. I don't know, but it does work. You can have it announce when you change the channels. I turned that off. I didn't care for it at the moment with me playing with it, but it can announce 1, 2, 3, 4. So if you know what channel it is, what channel number you're looking for, you'll hear it enunciate. The other bit that's confusing with why this would work the way you would think it would work is there's actually a nub on here for what channel number you're pointing to, but it's completely meaningless. So, whatever. It's more of a position selector, up, down with ticks in the middle. That's all it is. Don't expect a 16 channel automatic. I flip it to the 12th position and I'm on channel 12. Does not work that way at all. The other interesting bit to point out that I thought was kind of interesting, proof that this is an SDR, is when you turn the knob off, click, the screen is still on and it says powering down. That means this really is running software of some kind on here. It's not a physical on-off switch, and it is, software that's running. You can customize the startup screen on this. I put my call sign on it because, I'm boring. You can also upload an image file. I haven't done that yet. It's somewhat intriguing. For the speaker mic interface, you have your traditional 2-pin style speaker mic. That's also your programming cable, which I'll talk about again in a second. And on this side, we have our push-to-talk, a P1, a programmable button 1, and a programmable button 2. These are programmable in the software interface, so you can decide what short press and long press is for each of those. On the top, we have a signal receive button or LED indicator. Right now, it's probably receiving something on TAC 310, which I have active 24/7.
MD-UV380G, A1, the V80. Yeah, with the hotspot, I have it set on a power cell.
For testing purposes, I always wanted to receive TAC 310 while I was setting these up to make sure I was getting the code right. As you can hear, somebody's up on TAC 310. Across the bottom, the buttons are a nice firm press. You feel a click. It's not like a membrane keyboard where you're not sure if it goes down or not. Up-down buttons. We've got a menu button and an exit button over here. It's got a nice, solid feel to it. It doesn't feel like a Motorola radio, but it feels a little bit better than a Bofang radio. It's, again, a little bit more pricey than a Bofang radio, so it's one of those things you get what you pay for. Just turn it off here for a second, and I'll show you the antenna connector. Is a standard, as you would expect, female on the radio, male on the antenna. This is the antenna that came with it, nothing special here. Let's turn the radio back on. You cannot turn off that power up, which is somewhat annoying. I wish you could. Maybe a firmware or software update will give that configurable option in the future. Now, other features on here, low, medium, high power range for transmit, which is a really nice option, especially when you're using something like where I have a hotspot in the house. I want to transmit to that hotspot. Again, the rule of radio is use only as much power as you need, so I have this set to low power for my hotspot configurations and high power for my non-hotspot configurations when I'm around the town. This radio does support several zones, which is nice. So, for example, if I go into my menu system here, and I'll show you this in the software, I have 2 zones configured. Not that you can really see that horribly, kind of maybe. A home hotspot and a simplex at the moment. So for home hotspot, it has the frequencies configured for talking to my hotspot. For simplex, it has some simplex talk around frequencies to test out with other radios, both FM and digital. So that was kind of nice. It's got the signal bar in the top. It tells you that it's receiving signal. That's the only useful feature of that. Battery meter appears accurate though. It does have a battery meter in the top right side, as you would expect, a percentage progression down, which is kind of cool. So that's the basics of the radio. Overall, and here comes the cat to put in her 2 cents. Overall, I'm really happy with the radio. I'll show you the software configuration in a minute because that took a little bit of work. Something I do want to point out physically on the radio before I switch views here is this comes from the factory locked, probably to comply with the Chinese radio fallout of people using the radio who shouldn't be using the radio. So when I got this, it took me a little while to read the directions because we don't read directions. We're engineers, we figure this stuff out on our own, right? So when I got this, it was not transmitting or receiving anything. Whereas another radio I have, which I'm going to do a review on, worked perfectly. The trick is you have to leave the radio off, which it's turning off right now, push and hold the top button and bottom button, and then turn the radio on. And that will either lock or unlock the radio depending on what state it's in. It will basically toggle that. When it does that, from the factory, again, you're going to probably have it locked on 150 megahertz and 450 megahertz, and that's it. When you push and hold those together and then turn the radio on, it's going to toggle that lock switch. It will seem like the radio is working normally until you do that. You can program whatever frequencies you want. It'll show up. It'll even show transmit when you push the button, but it's not working. You have to do that unlock to make the radio actually work for you. So physically, everything, it's a decent radio. I've used it with a speaker mic hanging out the side just for convenience purposes. I've used it with the microphone built into it and the speaker built into it. I've gotten good signal reports from folks, no complaints. I've heard people perfectly fine. Again, no complaints. Solid audio quality coming out of this. No real DMR errors or noises coming out of this. Great radio for $145. Strongly recommend. So let's go into the programming software, and I'll show you some tips and tricks and where I landed on that, and some gotchas as well. So this is the programming software. This is from TYT directly. You should either use the software from TYT directly or the one that comes with the radio. I would not download it from anywhere else. TYT888.com is the official website. They're down right now, otherwise I would show you their website, what it looks like. It's kind of cheesy, kind of Chinesey. So if it doesn't look like a really well put together website and an English translation of a Chinese website, you're probably in the right place. TYT888.com. There's other places in the US that are reputable dealers. You can get the software from them as well. So let's walk through this real quick. I have yet to get in the new version of the software, my serial number, hardware version, or any of this to actually display properly, but here it is. The frequency range. This is basically not to configure the radio, but to configure the code plug. So you want to make sure that it is set to UV, which is your model of the radio. This again, MD-UV380. That's the basic information. The way this is set up is almost top to bottom, the way you would walk through the settings here. So I've got my general settings. A lot of these are preferences, things that you don't have to set. There's very few things on this page you do have to set, and I'm going to point them out real quick. We have the radio name. I put that as my call sign. Radio ID, very important. You need to get a registered radio ID, radioid.net, and put that in here. This is your unique identifier for your radio. Please do not use mine. Please do not use anybody else's. Please use yours. The rest of these are sort of dealer's choice. Backlight time, I had mine set to 15 seconds. Hang times, these are mostly defaults. You can fiddle with these settings. The channel hang times is how long it will hang the channel open during a connection to somebody else to avoid having to stand up that connection later. You can see I've got channel voice announcement disabled down here. I mentioned that earlier. And it's generally it. This page is pretty basic. Again, feel free to fiddle with some of these settings. They're not horribly complicated. TX preamble is an interesting one. It gives folks basically time to wake up the remote radios who might be in power saving mode. More important with commercial radios, but for ham radio we really don't kind of need it, but I leave it set at default. So next up, the menu items. This is for configuring the menu items on the radio itself. Most of these are used for commercial radios where you want to limit the interface on the radio itself so that people can't get in and make setting changes that they shouldn't be able to. It can also be used in our world, though, for making the radio simpler to use. So, for example, I unchecked radio check, remote monitor, radio enable, radio disable. I just didn't want to see those things in the menu, and basically enabled everything else because I want to make sure that everything else is there for my use in the menu system. Next, we have button definitions. The most important thing on here, I find, is the radio buttons, these top 4. This defines what these 2 buttons on the side do. The top and the bottom. Side button 1 is the top, side button 2 is the bottom. And you have a short press and a long press option. I have mine set to power select on short press and then tight normal squelch for a long press on the top. Bottom I have set for monitor for short press and scan on off for long press. Whatever features you want to use in the radio that you find value in having those buttons easily accessible for features, go for it. There's one-touch access here that you can use for calling your friends, calling your different channels up. At the moment, I don't have too many call signs that I directly access, so I have all these set to none. But you can configure those right in here for private message radio-to-radio calls across your network, across your repeater, whatever the case may be. So some handy little interface features here. Again, this is pretty common for DMR radios. Text messaging, you can configure default text messaging. We really don't do too much of that in ham radio, so I left that blank. Privacy setting is the encryption. Again, we're not allowed to use that in ham radio. I left it blank. Digit emergency system. This is used in commercial settings where you can push a panic button on the radio to send the emergency signal to other radios. We really don't use this in ham radio, so I left this alone, didn't configure anything. I basically just didn't touch it. Digital contacts. This is where your DMR stuff starts to get interesting. So in here, this is a bug in the software. I want to first explain this. You'll notice that the window doesn't really resize. Kind of annoying. This is a common thread with most Chinese radios. As I find these bugs, I try to reach out to the vendor. That's how they come up with new versions. If you find bugs, I encourage you to report them back to the vendor to get it fixed. In the digital radio space, there hasn't been a common file format yet, so applications like Chimp don't exist for digital radios, DMR radios more specifically. So I would suggest reaching out to the vendor to say, you know, hey, the app is broken, hey, there's spelling problems in places, and give them that feedback. So digital contacts. I'm not going to go into how DMR works. There's tons of other people who explain that, but maybe in a future video. What the digital contacts are in short version is those are the IDs of the folks you're trying to call, whether that be a group or a person. So for example, on the screen, I have a contact named GABM. So this is Georgia Brandmaster Talk Group. So in this case, they are Talk Group 3113. Another popular one here is I have TAC 310 on Brandmaster, which is Talk Group 310. These are all call groups, or group calls, I'm sorry, so you reach out to a bunch of people on these calls. You can optionally have a call receive tone where the radio will beep. I have mine set to no. You can also have private calls. So for example, on Brandmaster there is a parrot on ID 9990. So when you key that up and send it a message, it will send it to you back, so you can test your own audio, test your own experience as far as network jitter, stuff like that. So I just have that one added as well. I have a simplex talk group programmed in here, call ID 99. But this is where you list all of your flat-out call IDs. Now this is where I said everything starts to build on the menu system from top down on the left-hand side. When you get down to really programming the radio and programming the frequencies like you would traditionally on an analog radio, digital contacts is the first stop. You want to get the talk groups defined, you want to get the private IDs defined, you can do it in Excel, you can do it here, wherever you want to start with first, you want to define that before you go much further. So, digital contacts. Now, moving on, we have the digital RX group call. I'm going to go through this very simply because I still am a little fuzzy on the benefit of having multiple ones. I wish there was an easy way to switch them on the radio. However, what this basically means, a digital RX call group in the sense of this radio, the TYT MD-UV380, is when anything is in this call group, it will immediately interrupt what the radio is doing and play basically whatever's going on that talk group, that frequency, that channel, whatever the case is. So, for example, if I have my radio here set to, let's say, channel 1 and channel 2. Let's just go down the list here. I have Georgia and Atlanta Metro. And the top band, this is a 2, it has an A and a B on here, so it's dual watch. Should have said that earlier. This is a dual watch radio. So on dual watch, I could have Georgia set to 1 and Atlanta Metro set to 2, or A and B, depending on your definition. Now, that means if, say, MCOM has a key up, MCOM will also play over top of A or B, so Georgia or Atlanta Metro. Think of it sort of like a scan feature, but not. It will just constantly key up and listen to, or not key up, I'm sorry, constantly listen to those codes as well, and any talk group that comes up in this group. So very, very nice feature. They should all be off the same repeater, off the same frequency. I'm not sure what would happen if you put things on different frequencies in here. Probably wouldn't work. So all of these right now are hot-spotted, same frequency off my radio. So for example, if I were to add TAC 310 back over here, my radio constantly goes into open squelch because TAC 310 is very, very busy. I really don't want that, so I took it out of the group. Moving down, zone information. So I do have 2 zones configured here. This is one of the things I really like with DMR radios is the zone features. They had this on analog radios too, traditionally Motorola, more commercial radios, but they brought it over to these radios as well. So let me go through what a zone is. A zone on these, I have this one named Home Hotspot. What this is actually doing is breaking my channels up almost into radio configurations. So here I have channel number A, channel number B. As I mentioned earlier, we have an A and a B, a top and a bottom, a 1 and a 2, depending on how you want to word it. And it can listen to both, and you pick which one you want to transmit on. So I have my home hotspot defined so that every channel that has an HS in the parentheses, and this is going to make a little bit more second in a little bit, is a member of the home hotspot zone. This means when I'm not at my house, I can switch over to a secondary zone, say simplex, and when I go on the radio and switch my zone to simplex, only these 2 channels are going to be available to me, and it looks like I missed defining it on the B side. So let's just add those 2 now. That means I won't get options for the hotspot channels because I don't need them. It's way outside my range. Why would I bother doing that? So it's very nice to have your sort of predefined by region. If you're jumping between repeaters on a commute, on a hike, whatever the case is, you can program these zones and jump between them very easily on the radio. I kind of like it on the radio, how easy it is and simple to jump through the zones. So that's what the zones are for. Strongly encourage maybe 1 zone per repeater, 1 zone by town, however you feel like breaking it up, whatever's appropriate for how you're going to use the radio, that's what's important. Scan list. Just like you would expect with a scanner, you're defining the channels and the talk groups to listen on your scan, to listen while it scans. This is where you can put in multiple frequencies. I don't really use the scan feature. Don't really have a desire to. With the digital RX call group, it serves everything I need because usually I have my zone set for pure digital. It doesn't have to scan through frequencies. So it can go through everything in that zone because it is off of 1 repeater and listen to everything I need to in that call group. You can have a priority defined here, so it gives that channel priority, which is basically like, so for example, if you had 10 channels and the priority was 1, usually the way this works is it would go channel 1, channel 2, channel 1, channel 3, channel 1, channel 4. Because remember, the radio can really only listen to 1 thing at a time. So having those priorities defined for the ones you want to listen to most importantly is very important. And now we're getting down to the important part, channel information. So I'm going to show you 1 because they are mostly the same in the case of how I program my radio anyway. So channel information, this is for the Georgia Brandmaster on digital off my hotspot. So I pick my digital mode, bandwidth 12.5, pick what scan list I want it in. Squelch is on a range of 0 to 10, 1 being the lowest. You can skip reference frequency, you really don't need to worry about that. TOTS, 60 seconds is fine. Rekey, don't really need it. Power, again I mentioned earlier, use the least amount of power required to make the connection. So low on that case. Channel name, I've found through practice that you want to put some kind of nomenclature in your channels that defines what group they're in. So for example, I have the Georgia Brandmaster in here off of my hotspot, HS. Now, that is also bound not only to a talk group, which we'll see in a second, but a frequency pair. There are repeaters in my area that also support the Georgia Brandmaster. So they're on different frequencies. How would that work? Well, they'd go in different zones, but when I'm creating the zones, I need a way to differentiate them in the channel list. So in this case, I put parenthesis HS close paren to define that this is on my hotspot frequencies, which is here 445.025. So just encouraged to do that. It makes programming your radio a little bit easier. Admit criteria, this is based on how your hotspot or how your repeater is coded to let people in. Mine is configured for color code and a color code of 1, so I have that set. Autoscan, RX only, lone worker, Vox, those are depending on your needs. I don't need any of that stuff. I encourage you don't use it either. On the digital side now, this is where the pieces start to come together. I've got emergency system, none, because I said we're not using that. So basically that's how you disable that per channel. Contact name, let me just reopen this to remind you how all this is coming together now. Here, I define GABM as talk group 3113, so that pulls in the contact name. Group list that's in, again, Georgia groups. Color code, 1, because that's what my hotspot is listening for in the digital signal to let it in. Repeater slot, now 2. In my case, my hotspot only listens on repeater time slot 2. Your local one likely has, if it's a real repeater, it'll likely have 2 time slots. You want to make sure you pick the right one. In-call criteria, so that means if you're supposed to be receiving it, think of it as the digitally coded CTCSS or DCTSS that you would use on analog. That's basically what this is. So if your repeater, for example, is on 1, you want to set yours to 1. It's almost always the same for receive and transmit, so I have mine for follow admit criteria. This is basically your transmit tone. This is basically your receive tone. They are almost always the same. Privacy is for encryption, again, none. That's it. That's setting up a channel. Fairly easy. I suggest getting a code plug demo that's out there to start and build off of that, but there's no reason you can't just start making your own. That's what I did. That's how I got mine going and was pretty successful at it. Across the bottom in the CPS, which by the way, you're going to see CPS all over the place. That's just code plug software. I don't know what it actually stands for, but I call it code plug software. It's what you need to program your radio. Custom programming software. I believe Motorola probably coined that term a while ago. But anyway, in the interface here, it's sort of like an old Microsoft Access database would. You just tab through next frequency, last frequency, or previous frequency, first, last. If you want to add, you push the add button, or you can right click over here and hit add. Let's hop to an analog channel here. For example, here's the 2-meter calling frequency. So I flip this to analog up top, specify my bandwidth. Most ham is wideband, so 25 kilohertz. And the same things apply. Your channel name, your receive frequency, your transmit frequency. Here's your tones. If you're using tones, again in the admit criteria, just like we talked about a bit ago for the digital, you define your admit criteria. And then here's your transmit. So you set up your tones if you're doing tones for transmit. Transmit signaling system, if you're doing DTMF tones, you enable that there. Receive signaling, again, if you're doing DTMF tones. And for receiving tones to unlock the radio, you configure those here as well. So again, if your repeater tower, is using tones, you would configure that here with correct CTCSS, and then define whatever CTCSS tones you're using for transmit and receive. Again, both of them are typically the same down here. So that's that for analog. Let me revert these back to none. And I will show you one last thing in the UI, which is the VFO mode. VFO mode basically configures the radio for when you're in VFO mode, adjusting frequencies one at a time for whatever purpose. I have mine set to analog. Bandwidth of 12.5, so I have a finer degree of tuning on the radio. High power when it's in VFO mode. I'm sorry, this is broken. Step is set to 2.5. Bandwidth should still be 25K. I don't know why it was set that way, but whatever the case may be. Admit criteria, I have tones turned off because I don't know what frequency I'm going to be on. I don't know what the needs are, and you can adjust that on the radio as needed. So that's the high level. As you've seen, the UI is a little quirky. It gets the job done. I don't want to critique it too much because the radio for $150, most CPS packages from a company like Motorola for commercial radios, you have to pay extra money to get the CPS. They give you this software for free, so it's generally a limited group of folks maintaining that software. So it's not awful. It's very, very workable. I've programmed my radio 4 or 5 times a day using the software. It's totally doable. Don't sweat it. One thing to note, this is version 1.10 from TYT directly. This works with varying levels of firmware on the radio. I will tell you, don't upgrade the firmware on the radio unless you absolutely have to, because you can break your radio. You have to be very careful doing it. Unless there's a reason to, read the release notes. Just make sure you're upgrading your radio for a good reason. If you have to, you don't want to put that risk on doing it. So once you get your plug done, you hit this button here for write, and it will push the programming to the radio. And then I will show you the programming cable and some reasons to be careful here in 1 second. So when I got my radio, the programming cable was actually broken. It wasn't being detected by the software. Every time I'd plug it into the computer would give me an invalid USB device. So that's what's interesting with these new TYT radios and digital radios, is this is the programming cable, what you would expect to see from most radio programming cables. USB on one side, and then your headset type connector on the other side. However, this is another TYT cable for another radio, looks similar, works differently. This is another cable from another radio, looks similar, works differently. So, labeling these cables, critically important. This one, for example, is for my RD5R, which I've labeled with a little sticky on the bottom of it. You have to find a system in your shack for labeling these cables. The way these radios work is these are not a serial interface like most other Bofang radios, for example, are. Even the digital Bofang doesn't work this way, or with a serial interface. This emulates a mouse somehow. When you install the CPS driver, or CPS software, it installs a driver for this particular cable. So you should have no issues once you install the CPS software. Mine, somehow, the electronics in here to prove, I guess, that it's a genuine cable or something were broken. Radioddity sent me a new one. After a little bit of troubleshooting, we ruled it was either the radio or the cable. Thankfully, it was the cable. I got the new cable plugged in, and it worked like a champ. So when you plug the cable in, your computer's not going to detect anything right away. It won't detect anything until you plug this into the radio and turn the radio on. Then it will detect that there's a device attached to the port. When you go into the GUI and push the configuration, your radio will say PC programming, and that's how your code plug gets loaded into the radio. So programming cable, very important. And it slides right in here into our speaker mic connector, just like a headset would. From my experience, it doesn't suck down a lot of extra power when you're programming, so you don't have to have it docked or anything like that. Excuse me, while you're programming it. So that's the TYT MD-UV380. Overall, again, I like this radio. It's been my primary as soon as I got it working with the right cable, getting up on the hotspot. Everything runs really good with it. A+ so far. I have used one Motorola in my past, which I know is sort of like the gold standard for DMR. Frankly, there's some UI quirks, but in terms of the things that really matter, audio quality, selectability on the frequencies, this thing seems spot on. I've had no problems. In fact, I'm debating getting a second one and putting another one in another vehicle. And I'm actually debating now getting the mobile version, the 9800, I believe it is, sometime in the future, and putting that in my car because it works on the same plugs, and I'm hoping for great compatibility between the two. So, recommend this radio to anybody. The MD-380, the single band version, works just as well. I've talked to a bunch of folks on that through my hotspot. They love their MD-380. The UV380 is an upgraded version of that. For example, the MD-380 I mentioned earlier, you don't have to. There's a program out there called 380 Tools to let you do more on that radio. TYT apparently listened, and most of the features, if not all of the features in 380 Tools, are natively supported by the UV380. So UV380, way to go. You don't have to install an extra firmware. It just works. Great little radio. Great price. I got it on sale, but even not on sale, it was $144 from Radioddity. Strong recommend from Radioddity. Strong recommend for me for the radio as well. So that's it. If you have questions, comments, thoughts, concerns, innermost feelings, want to say hi to the cat, feel free to post down below in the comments. If you like this review, don't forget to please give it the thumbs up, and also subscribe to my channel if you want to see more content from me. If you don't, I'm going to keep making it anyway, so who cares? But seriously, if you subscribe, it'll help me get my channel more popular and get that custom branded URL that I'm looking for. But I got 1,000 subscribers to do that. So please, if you like it, share the channel, subscribe, like the videos, and just keep them rolling. So that's the radio. That's my opinion. There you have it. This is Brian, the overworked IT guy. Whiskey 2 Bravo Juliet Mike. Watch for me on TAC 310 or any of the Georgia talk groups. And 73s. Thanks for watching.